is it worth getting the iPod Touch 7th generation here in 2025? So this device came out back in 2019, and I've been using this device for a couple years now. And from my own experience, it's a pretty nice device. It's very portable, but I definitely would recommend getting it here in 2025. And in this video, I'll be covering why that is. And I'm also going to be covering the design, the specs, and what it's like using the iPod Touch here in 2025. So starting off with the design, the iPod Touch 7th generation is very small. And if we hold it next to the iPhone 5, you'll see that it's actually the same size. And the screen size is only 4 inches diagonally. And for comparison, more modern iPhones like the iPhone 16 Pro, for example, has a 6.3 inch display if we measure it diagonally. So this device is definitely very small. And some of the other device features that I like is that it's one of the thinnest Apple devices ever made. And also at the bottom, we still have the headphone jack, and we also have the Lightning connector instead of the USB-C port. And that's all there is to cover for the design of the iPod Touch. Let's now talk about the specs. So starting off with the battery, this device only has 1000 mAh of battery. And for comparison, a more modern iPhone like the iPhone 16 Pro, for example, has a 3500 mAh battery. And from my own personal experience, the iPod Touch only lasts me about 2 to 3 hours. So if you want to get this device, you could also consider getting a separate battery case for it. Now another downside to this device is the camera quality. So the rear camera only goes up to 12 megapixels and the front camera goes up to 7. And as for the video quality, the rear camera goes up to 1080p at 30 frames per second and the front camera goes up to 720p at 30 frames per second. So you definitely won't be getting good camera quality out of this. From my own personal experience, it's good enough for FaceTime, but the footage is nothing that you'd want to use for social media. So moving on to the display, like I mentioned earlier, the iPod Touch does have a very small display. It's only 4 inches diagonally, and the screen resolution isn't that high either. It only goes up to 1136 by 640, but this is still good enough for the iPod Touch because of how small the display is. You won't really see the pixels. You can see that it's actually 326 pixels per inch. So the display is decent, but it's just very small, and sometimes it can get hard to type. And that's really all there is to cover for the display of this device. Let's now talk about the speeds of the iPod Touch. So the iPod Touch 7th generation has the Apple A10 Fusion chip, which is the same one from the iPhone 7, but it is underclocked, so you could expect this device to be about as fast as the iPhone 6s. And it also has 2 GB of RAM, which is the same amount as on the iPhone 7 and the 6s. And for comparison, the latest iPhone has 8 GB of RAM. Now let's also talk about the storage. So this device has 3 different storage models. There's the standard 32 GB, but there's also 128 and 256 GB. So if you get the right storage model, then this shouldn't really be an issue for you. And the final thing that we need to cover for the specs of this device is the software support. So the iPod Touch only goes up to iOS 15, but it does still get security updates. So once in a while, when Apple sees that there's a bug on the iPod Touch, they'll release a security update to fix that. But the last 3 years, this device hasn't gotten the latest iOS updates. So is the iPod Touch still worth buying? My recommendation is that you don't get it because there are much better alternatives. You could get this device for about 80 bucks. And for that same price, you could get yourself the iPhone SE 2, which is much faster. The camera quality is a lot better. The battery is going to last you much longer. And if you have a larger budget, you can also consider the iPhone 12 mini, which you could get for about 200 bucks. And it's actually very small. Here it is next to the iPod Touch. And another great option would be the iPhone SE 1st generation, which you could get for about 25 to 30 bucks, which is a third of the price of the iPod Touch. And both of these devices have very similar specs. You can see they're both the same size. And I will have reviews for all of these devices down in the description. But overall, I definitely don't recommend getting the iPod Touch here in 2025. And that's basically all there is for this video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and check out my channel to see more videos like this in the future. And if you have any other video suggestions, make sure to leave them down in the comments below.